Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. Apologize for the late start, but welcome. This is a broadcast to mark the anniversary of Julian Assange's imprisonment. He's been in Belmarsh prison for 5 years. So, as you join, welcome. I'm the editor of the Dissenter newsletter, which you can find over at thedissenter.org. If you go to the website, that's where I post regular updates on Julian Assange's case. And today, you'll find a chronicle of Julian Assange's time in Belmarsh. And I go through what's happened year by year. And I'd like to highlight some of those details that I shared as we mark this dismal, bleak milestone for not only Julian Assange, but also freedom of the press in general. This is a milestone for a journalist who has been imprisoned or in detention in some form or another for the past nearly 15 years. And 5 years of it in this facility that has a reputation of being called Britain's Guantanamo. But back in December 2010, after WikiLeaks published documents from U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, it was the case that Julian Assange was hounded, essentially. He was hounded and eventually ended up being detained. He was put in house arrest. He faced allegations from Sweden. And I won't speak to those allegations specifically, but they involved allegations of sexual assault. There were improprieties on the part of the Swedish prosecution authority and how they handled the case. And whatever was going on there was never any form of justice. The defendant and the plaintiffs were not treated fairly. And then you look at what was happening in the US government, and they did not shut down the investigation into Julian Assange, a grand jury investigation. Prosecutors under Attorney General Eric Holder did not indict Julian Assange, but there was uncertainty. There was a cloud hanging over Julian Assange, and it was unclear as to what would happen. So Julian Assange stayed in the London embassy, Ecuador's London embassy. He was there from summer of 2012 all the way through to April 11th, 2019, this date when we are marking the 5th anniversary of Julian Assange's arrest. And so as I take you through some of what Julian Assange has had to endure, we think about the state of freedom of the press in the world. I'm aware that there's a hearing happening in the House on this date. I don't know yet how many times or if Julian Assange's name's come up at all, but I think it's connected to a federal reporter's shield law that is being considered. The House has already passed it. The Senate has been asked to pass this law, and Joe Biden has been asked to sign this legislation so that there can be some modest protections for journalists, U.S. journalists, from being subpoenaed. And so we'll see what happens here. We'll see if that, in fact, does become the law. And I might get to that a little bit later in the broadcast. But welcome. Thank you for being here. If you're unfamiliar with my work, I've been covering this story for the past 15 years. I've been documenting and following what's happening with WikiLeaks and these publications. I've been looking at, I covered Chelsea Manning's court-martial. I spent many hours, many days on Julian Assange's case, reporting on the extradition hearing that was held back in September 2020, and then all the hearings in between in some form or another. I've posted coverage to thedissenter.org. And just a quick note here, a little housekeeping note, if you are so inclined to support this journalism and the work that is done by me and then anybody else who might be featured on the website. We have guest contributors that have Times been willing to provide coverage and help me. Mohammed Almazi, who's based in London, helped me the last time that we had an appeal hearing to cover the proceedings. I encourage you to go to thedissenter.org/donate and make this independent journalism possible. The funding that I receive from you, people who view these broadcasts, people who read my work, people who share this journalism widely, that's what makes it possible to do this journalism. Don't submit money or pay any money to Google. Don't give money to Google. Go to thedissenter.org/donate if you are interested in helping me continue this work. Now, here we go. So in 2019, Julian Assange was brought to the Belmarsh prison. And when he was brought to Belmarsh prison, it was quite a spectacle. We all saw, actually, the only outlet that captured Julian Assange being expelled from Ecuador's London embassy was RT. And Russia Today had the video. It went all over. It was licensed, and it showed a man who was unkempt. As we learned later, that was deliberate. A shaving kit was taken from Julian Assange. And so he had this scraggly beard. He looked like a hermit. He looked like a recluse, like somebody who had been captive inside of an embassy for a long time. He was dragged. He was yelling, pleading for help, pleading for mercy from authorities as police loaded him into a van. I won't replay the video. I don't think it's necessary, but obviously I could. And then he was taken to Belmarsh prison. He had all kinds of belongings that were his, that was confiscated. The FBI helped facilitate, the Ecuador authorities helped facilitate the confiscation of archives, library materials that Julian Assange had maintained. And we can presume that those are in the hands of the US government. The FBI was given some of Julian Assange's property, and the Ecuador government refused to return it to Julian Assange when a request was submitted. Julian Assange was brought. His health was poor. During this time in Ecuador's London embassy, we should understand that he has no access to sunlight. He has no access to dental care. He has very, very limited access to medical treatment. There are machines that you need in a hospital that he could not access, being in political asylum, being a political asylee who was in the Ecuador embassy. And so finally, he goes to Belmarsh, and while it isn't what I consider to be top-notch healthcare, there was some modicum of healthcare available to him. He could now have dental and other physical ailments treated. And yet his condition was deteriorating, and it seemed to deteriorate pretty rapidly. We know that in the first month of time that he was there, of course, when he was dragged out, we saw that the Justice Department revealed the first charge that would be leveled against Julian Assange, and that's the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge. It's not a hacking offense, although it's treated like a hacking offense. He is not accused of hacking, but this was the narrative that was first put out there to lay a foundation before the US government came forward with the 17 Espionage Act offenses that would be revealed or unveiled in an indictment in May 2019. It was sort of this thing of, hey, we're not really going after the First Amendment. We are going after Julian Assange because he helped Chelsea Manning, we say, break into a military computer or move about it anonymously when she was taking documents that were provided to WikiLeaks. So that's the accusation that was put forward there. And you had groups, civil liberties organizations and press freedom organizations and others and attorneys and people who follow this subject who are well-meaning basically get fooled. They were fooled, and they said, "Oh, well, maybe we don't need to panic. Perhaps the Justice Department is going to avoid a case that truly implicates issues of freedom of the press." They were wrong. And I could see from the moment that that charge was brought forward that there would be Espionage Act offenses. So as these offenses, these charges are unveiled, he's in decline. And what we learn from Niels Meltzer, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, after Julian Assange was sentenced, I need to make sure that I don't forget this part. Assange is hauled before a British court. He is sentenced to 50 weeks in prison as punishment for seeking political asylum from Ecuador while Sweden was attempting to extradite him. He receives a sentence that is longer than one that is handed down to a person named Jack Shepard. He was dubbed the Speedboat Killer. He received 6 months for breaching bail. He was also avoiding extradition. That sentence for Julian Assange was longer than somebody who killed somebody. So Meltzer, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Meltzer, visits Julian Assange in Belmarsh on May 9th. There are 2 medical experts who accompany Meltzer, and they are people who are experts on examining potential torture survivors. It is reported on May 31st that Assange, quote, showed all the symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. Consider that for a moment. So as we sit here today, 5 years out from Julian Assange being imprisoned, Julian Assange was showing signs of psychological torture nearly 5 years ago. And nearly 5 years ago, it was known that this kind of detention would be detrimental to his well-being and that he would suffer. And yet, this cruel and inhuman treatment has been allowed to unfold. For somebody who is charged with nonviolent offenses, he has been put in a prison that was revamped. It's been around for decades, but post September 11th attacks, it became the place that the UK would hold terrorists and put them through what they considered to be legal proceedings. And so Julian Assange was visited by Meltzer. This was the observation. You had friends like Australian journalist John Pilger. And John Pilger unfortunately died. This is part of the passage of time when we're talking about this. When you think of the 5 years that have gone by, there's this time lost, and I'll keep coming back to the time lost as I go through what Julian Assange has endured, what a publisher has endured. But this person is no longer there. He was a friend, and he will never get to be with his friend John Pilger ever again. But when Julian Assange was visited, he was not well. This was in May. And Pilger said there was a need for a great deal of diagnostic care and rehabilitation. He's gone through an extraordinary physical and mental ordeal, and now he's having to go through this case. Upon completing his prison sentence, though, the judge in a UK court would not set Julian Assange free, would not allow him to be granted bail. And so Julian Assange stayed in Belmarsh. She believed that he would abscond, that's the word, to flee, go to some other country and seek, seek asylum. Again, they do not believe in this concept of seeking asylum unless you're Chinese or Russian. I mean, I would imagine that if somebody from China or Russia entered any of these embassies, the U.S. State Department would be trying to meet that person and learn everything about their background before They trumpeted their case to the whole world. In the case of Julian Assange, as he has been seeking or was seeking a Latin American country that would take him, they didn't like that, and that's been treated as him trying to flee justice. So a court kept him in Belmarsh. And there's an event that occurs on October 21st, 2019. Former British ambassador Craig Murray, who's known for writing these dispatches about legal proceedings, what he observes in Julian Assange's case. He's a witness. He goes to the Westminster Magistrates Court. It's a hearing before a larger extradition hearing that'll take place in 2020. And he shares what he's observed. He says, "I was badly shocked by just how much weight my friend has lost, by the speed his hair has receded, and by the appearance of premature and vastly accelerated aging. He has a pronounced limp I've never seen before. Since his arrest, he has lost over 15 kilograms. For those of you in the States, that's about 33 pounds. He continues, Murray says, when asked to give his name and date of birth, he struggled visibly over several seconds to recall both. I do not understand how this process is equitable, Assange declared. This superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case, and I can't even access my writings. It is very difficult where I am to do anything. These people have unlimited resources. So he sees Assange make a statement, but it's a real struggle. And what Murray adds is that his voice drops. He became increasingly confused and incoherent. He spoke of whistleblowers and publishers being labeled enemies of the people, and then spoke about his children's DNA being stolen and of being spied on in his meetings with his psychologist. I'm not suggesting that all that Julian was wrong about these points, but he could not properly frame or articulate them. He was plainly not himself, very ill, and it was just horribly painful to watch. Baretzer showed neither sympathy nor the least concern. Baretzer is District Judge Vanessa Baretzer, and she is the person who held Julian Assange's future in her hands. She tartly observed that if he could not understand what had happened, his lawyers could explain it to him, and then swept out of court. So this was how a court handled the allegations being made about mistreatment. I believe at this time, I skipped over this, but I need to backtrack because at the end of May, and after Niels Meltzer visits Julian Assange in prison, he is moved into a medical ward of Belmarsh. And the conditions there are tantamount to solitary confinement. He is being kept in very isolating conditions. And so it isn't until we get to, and let's go to the next year. It isn't until we get to 2020 that Julian Assange is moved because of the fact that we have people in the prison, prisoners, as well as his lawyers, who are lobbying the Belmarsh administrators, the warden in particular, to put him in a wing with some of the inmates, put him somewhere where he can socialize and not go through the kind of mental distress that is occurring because he is isolated. And so these prisoners, they want to be there, and they support Julian Assange, and he is eventually set free. We have a hearing that is held in February. I was able to get to it. It was a legal hearing. There were legal arguments about the way that extradition law was being applied, and it was dry, but they were important issues about political offenses, what Julian Assange had done, and it was whether the actions that he engaged in as a journalist should be protected, which obviously I believe that he engaged in freedom of the press, or he has rights, that he was engaged in exercising his freedom of expression by publishing those documents. And there were arguments about the treaty between the United States and the UK. This lasted for about a week. But during that time, what we get to observe as journalists and any members of the public who were able to attend, although there was very limited access for the public, is Julian Assange is kept in a glass box in this courtroom. It's like a national security or terrorism court that is adjoined to Belmarsh prison. Remember, I said that it's been referred to as Britain's Guantanamo. But if you look in the room, there was this clear glass container that he was kept in, which was very isolating. He's not really able to exchange notes with his lawyers. It's hard to participate and follow the proceedings. He can't hear. I saw this farcical episode unfold where he was given headphones and he put the headphones over his head to listen, but the headphones weren't really working. So he just discards them, sets them off to the side, and sits there like a kid lost in class, who can't really follow the lesson that the teacher is trying to teach their students. And so he just sat there, and there was nothing he could do because nobody really cared whether Julian Assange could follow the proceedings or not. He petitioned and asked to sit with his lawyers in the courtroom, but was not allowed to do so, even though the US government had no objection. It was basically a controlling maneuver by Judge Vanessa Baretzer, to say, I'm not going to give you this kind of treatment. I'm not going to help you out and let you sit with your attorneys. I'm going to treat you like, you potentially engaged in mass murder and keep you behind this glass container. So there are complaints made. He's being abused through this legal process. You'll hear throughout this the idea of punishment by process. I think that's very real as you observe what Julian Assange, or as you consider what Julian Assange has gone through. So as I go back to what's happening in 2020, we're in 2020 now. So I got this legal proceeding, and then we can't ignore the pandemic. The pandemic hits. You have COVID shutting down the world. You have countries closing their borders. You have all kinds of court cases sidelined, people in prisons, people who are detainees. There are calls for those individuals who do not have to be kept in these facilities to be released to home confinement or some other way of confinement, so that they can be tracked. Then they're not in these facilities that are at risk of the spread of COVID. And there's a bail request. They appeal to Judge Baretzer to release Julian Assange, but she says no. So what kind of life is Julian Assange living now as a result of the pandemic? He is in his cell, according to a friend named Vaughn Smith, who provided him a place to live when he was living under house arrest in 2010. He gets half an hour of exercise, but beyond that, he's confined alone in a cell for 23 and a half hours a day. And he might be able to go out in a yard crowded with some other prisoners. There were over 150 Belmarsh prison staff that were off work. They were self-isolating. The prison was barely functioning at this point. There were deaths, at least 2 deaths, but probably there were more. And the virus was ripping through the prison. So he was kept inside, and he was not able to see his children or Stella until the last week of August in 2020. It was the first time that she saw him. And when she sees Julian Assange, Stella says that he looks a lot thinner. He's wearing a yellow armband to indicate his level of prisoner status. You can see how thin his arms were. And at that time, we have another indictment, the final superseding indictment, but one that just pours a little bit more salt in Julian Assange's wounds. It adds all these allegations, trying to make it look like he consorts with hackers and that he's out, that criminal enterprise is what WikiLeaks is all about. Basically, on the part of the US government, they want to convince the judge that even if you don't find that his source protection that he provided Chelsea Manning, allegedly, if you believe that he was chatting with Chelsea Manning, or that someone from WikiLeaks was chatting with Chelsea Manning, that any effort to help her maintain anonymity and not get caught, if you don't think that that is a crime, then look at these allegations that we were able to get from people who were FBI informants people who I think we should be really suspicious about their claims, and some of them have even been recanted. There were lies that were told by Ziggy Tordarson, a serial criminal, a lying sociopath, and a convicted pedophile, but nonetheless, someone who the Justice Department referenced as teenager one, even though he's an adult now or was an adult when these allegations were brought forward. They tried to hide his identity because it's embarrassing that they're using someone like him to try and further this political case against Julian Assange. And they mention Edward Snowden. They say that WikiLeaks helped Edward Snowden. And so that is why Julian Assange should be prosecuted. They put all that in this indictment, and it comes before this major extradition hearing, which is held, and they have the hearing in London. I was not able to attend physically. I chose to do it remotely with the pandemic that was ripping through the world. It was a much different proceeding. It lasted for a full month, and people are called to testify. And Julian Assange does attend. We do get to see him. There are glimpses of him. And then I think there are some days toward the end where he just does not go and participate in the proceedings. And during those proceedings, during this extradition hearing, we hear from Dr. Quentin Deely, who is not just a doctor who gets picked up and asked to help out Assange's legal team, but he was somebody who worked for the National Health Service, and he conducted an autism diagnosis. He did a test. He interviewed Julian Assange for 6 hours in July, and he does diagnose Julian Assange with Asperger's syndrome. And he learns from Assange that he fears being held in solitary confinement in U.S. prison, that he feels that he could face the same fate as Joshua Schulte, who was held in extraordinarily brutal confinement conditions in a prison in New York. He's the person who was convicted of leaking the Vault 7 materials to WikiLeaks. And Deely says that if extradited, he believes that Assange is at risk of suicide. He's ruminating. He ruminates about his prospective circumstances at length, and it causes Julian Assange a sense of horror. He would find it, quote, an unbearable ordeal. And I think his inability to bear that in the context of an acute worsening depression would confer high risk of suicide. Then there's also this incident involving a gay Brazilian named Manuel Santos. And Manuel Santos is someone who is confined in the facility alongside Julian Assange. He has his own case unfolding. He's fighting deportation to Brazil, which is ruled by Jair Bolsonaro. And this guy is a fascist, and he's anti-gay. He's an open bigot, and Manuel does not want to return to Brazil, but he's struggling in his case to prevent this from happening. And he commits suicide. He commits suicide on November 2nd, 2020. And what Stella shares about Manuel is that he was a tenor. He had this voice that Julian Assange thought was beautiful. He helped Julian read letters in Portuguese. People that were sending him these letters from all over the world. Here was someone who could translate. He feared deportation to Brazil after 20 years. Being gay put him at risk where he was from. So there's a COVID outbreak after this takes place, after this tragedy. And that happens in the prison block in November. And that brings us to 2021. So let's go here. Let's turn. It's 2021. And in 2021, we get a ruling from District Judge Vanessa Baretzer. And District Judge Vanessa Baretzer says, and someone is commenting that they don't like that I have these earbuds in my ears. Yeah, I have them in my ears because after I go through all of this, I would like to play some clips. And rather than have the audio come out and ruin the broadcast, I would like to have them already in my ears so I could seamlessly move from this lengthy presentation of what Julian Assange has gone through in Belmarsh. And so, yeah, but sorry for the tangent. I just caught my attention here as it popped up. But thank you all for watching. We're in 2021. We're only a little more than a year and a half. We're coming up on 2 years in Julian Assange's imprisonment. And I just have some more detail to provide and add to what I've been saying. And then I'm going to play a couple clips before ending the broadcast. But yeah, it's 2021. And on January 4th, 2021, we hear from the court as they present their ruling on the extradition that Julian Assange will not be extradited, that the U.S.'s request will be denied because extraditing Julian Assange to the United States would be oppressive for mental health reasons. And so he's spared momentarily. And the United States now has to find a way to salvage. And they do. That's why we're still here talking about this case, because they are able to find a way to, do what they need to do to still continue this political case. And so 2 days later, Julian Assange has been spared. It's been said that it would be oppressive if Julian Assange was extradited. And he comes before Baretzer, the district judge, and he asks if he could be granted bail. And the judge again sides with the U.S. government and keeps him in Belmarsh. She agrees with the U.S. government that the fact that WikiLeaks previously helped NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden is reason why he should stay in Belmarsh. She also is told by the lawyers representing the U.S. government's interests that Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has offered asylum to Julian Assange. And so if he is granted bail, he is likely to go to Mexico's London embassy and seek asylum and then escape prosecution, much like he was doing when he went to Ecuador's London embassy. So the district judge accepts almost all of this, and so she even says that this huge support network that Assange has amassed, these are people who will aid him if he would choose to go to ground. Those are her words, and she keeps him in Belmarsh. At this time, Stella Assange, his children, others are trying to remain cautiously optimistic because President Joe Biden has been elected. Donald Trump is no longer in office. This is a president. This is an administration that generally speaks about the First Amendment and talks about how important it is for people to support human rights and democracy. So maybe there's going to be an opening for Julian Assange to be set free and released from Belmarsh. But as it turns out, that is a misplaced way of approaching the case, because Joe Biden does not reverse course. His people at the Justice Department inherit this case from Donald Trump, and they, I don't know if enthusiastic is the word, but they are more than willing to carry the torch that has been handed to them by Trump's Justice Department and see it to its end. And they still are today. We don't have any indication yet, although there are plea negotiations that have been reported, that Julian Assange won't be prosecuted or won't be brought to the U.S. and put on trial. His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons makes 2 unannounced visits to Belmarsh, and what we learn is that the rates of violence are spiking in the facility despite these COVID restrictions that have been imposed. The prison has not paid sufficient attention to the growing levels of self-harm, and there was not enough oversight or care taken of prisoners at risk of suicide, according to this inspector. There's urgent action that needs to be taken in this area to make sure that these prisoners are kept safe. Assange has a mini stroke, He has a mini stroke at the end of October. It happens during a hearing, an appeal hearing, the U.S. government's appeal hearing before the British High Court of Justice. They're bringing their assurances, their promises, which are not worth all that much because there's ways that they can get around any pledges that they make to the courts, but the courts don't really care all that much about the different loopholes in the pledges they're making about how he would be treated in U.S. custody, in a U.S. prison, or in U.S. detention. He has a mini stroke. And of course, this is alarming. It's just something that really hits home the toll that this is taking on Julian Assange physically and mentally. And then on December 10th, the British High Court rules in favor of the U.S. government's appeal. And we go into the next year with Julian Assange now being on the losing end. And his team has to find a way to get the Supreme Court, the legal system, to hear his concerns, to hear his complaints, to hear his challenge to how his human rights are being violated. And it's really difficult to get them to care about anything that is happening to Julian Assange. So here we are. We're in 2022. And in 2022, what is most important about this year is that there's a bittersweet moment for Julian Assange. The bittersweet moment is that he gets to he gets to have a wedding ceremony. Here they are. This isn't at the wedding, but this is a representation of the love between Stella and Julian Assange. These are two people who, after asking repeatedly, the Belmarsh prison finally gives a ceremony, allows them to hold a very small private ceremony at Belmarsh prison. They invite a few family members. Gabriel and Max come to the prison for a wedding, and they're all dressed. They look wonderful. Wedding dress is designed by Vivienne Westwood, who, again, another figure who is dead, who is no longer with us because of the time that Julian Assange has been imprisoned. He, was not able to ever be outside of the prison walls and thank her for what she was doing, or they weren't able to just have a normal wedding like most people have who are not political prisoners or families of political prisoners, and invite her to do a dress and then have very, I'm sure would have been an incredible event. So the prison has this thing about photos. While they are at the ceremony or ahead of the ceremony, there's issues getting a photographer granted permission to come and take photographs. They want to make sure that the photographs will keep private. They're afraid of what will happen if the public sees Julian Assange and Stella Assange embracing each other in this moment, and it humanizes Julian Assange. I think all along, the fact that Julian Assange built a family while he was facing this targeting, this war on WikiLeaks, while he was enduring it, it's something that has gotten deeply under the skin of prosecutors and other officials who want Julian Assange to be punished and still do not back down from this belief that he should go through this cruelty. And so this moment happens. We do see some photos, but yeah, they did think that photos would be a security risk for the prison. I mean, then that basically reveals everything you need to know about the culture and the psyche of these people. So going through 2022, it's a fight. It's an effort to try and find a way to get an appeal before the UK Supreme Court. The UK Supreme Court doesn't want to review it, so then the extradition goes to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and the extradition is authorized to the United States. And now we have a full appeal for Julian Assange. And we're in limbo. There's legal limbo. And Assange later in the year is there's another COVID outbreak that takes place at the prison. He's locked in his cell for 24 hours a day. And so this is what 2022 is basically all about. You get to 2023, and in 2023, Julian Assange is finally getting some support from the Australian government. Finally, the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and when others in Parliament are coming to his support, he gets a visit on April 4th by a High Commissioner, an Australian High Commissioner, whose name is Stephen Smith. He's a High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and he goes to the prison and he talks with Julian Assange. He's there to check on his health, and he wants to perhaps set up regular visits with Julian Assange. This would be good for Julian Assange. But on that same day, Reporters Without Borders sends a couple of their own, Secretary General Christophe Deloire and Director of Operations Rebecca Vincent, well known for her advocacy and efforts to follow the case against Julian Assange. They go to Belmarsh and they are blocked from entering the prison. They're not allowed to go. And the prison makes some nonsensical statement about how they have intelligence that they received that Rebecca Vincent and Christophe Deloire are actually journalists. They're not just people from this press freedom organization. And I don't know why it makes any difference whatsoever, since they were coordinating with the prison. But this is an excuse that Belmarsh prison governor Jenny Lewis uses to deny them access. And of course, this is the same day that High Commissioner visits with Julian Assange. So later in May, this is kind of a bright moment, maybe one of the more bright moments, but we learned some extraordinary details about Julian Assange and what he's living through in Belmarsh. And he does it through a satirical letter that is written to King Charles, who has ascended to the throne. He's now the monarch. And since the prison goes from being Her Majesty's prison Belmarsh to His Majesty's prison Belmarsh, Julian Assange welcomes King Charles, and he says very satirically, "I am honored to reside within the walls of this world-class institution. Truly, your kingdom knows no bounds." And then he encourages King Charles to come and visit the facility. And what we gain from reading this letter is the first public letter that Julian Assange posts or shares or allows his legal team feels comfortable sharing it with the world. He didn't write anything since he was arrested on April 11th, 2019. And we learned that he's having things like blended tuna heads, and there are kinds of gross foods, reconstituted forms, purportedly that is made from chicken, and that Belmarsh prisoners do not get to eat in some kind of mess hall. They dine alone in their cells. And then if you go to the healthcare part of Belmarsh, it is known as Hellcare. And it is a place that is obviously terrible. And Julian Assange would know. We spent time there. I imagine this is what he's talking about. He spent time there in 2019. Then there's the Belmarsh End of Life Suite, where people will cry out, "Brother, I'm going to die in here." And he mentions the wildlife that's around this prison. We've got crows that are nesting on the razor wire. There's hungry rats. And then there are ducklings. And he describes these wayward mallards that are on the prison grounds. And he says to King Charles, "Don't delay, though. If you want to see these mallards, you must get here, because the ravenous rats ensure that their lives are fleeting." So we get some colorful insight into what is happening at Belmarsh from Julian Assange himself. And it's fantastic that he still has his wits, at least can write. I don't know if he can speak in this manner anymore. But towards the end of 2023, journalist Charles Glass, who had previously visited Assange in the embassy, I mean, I should say that he has other meetings with people. Roger Waters goes, Yanis Varoufakis goes. So there are people who are now being able to visit, and COVID's no longer an issue that is preventing him from seeing Stella and other people regularly. So he's getting visitors. That's good. He sees Charles Glass, who comes and then later writes an article for The Nation about Julian Assange's paleness, looking deathly, how unwell he has become. He's still confined in his cell 23 out of every 24 hours. He gets an hour of recreation within 4 walls. So it's not really like he's outside. He's having porridge for breakfast, then soup for lunch, not much else for dinner. The food is again put through the slots. It's hard to make friends in the prison. So it's not a lot of social interaction. He has a radio now, but they had to fight to get the radio. The prison didn't want to give him a radio. And then we learned that he has been able to push and push and push and get the prison to allow books in his cell. In fact, he has a couple hundred books and he cannot receive books anymore. But something that is sad to learn, and we all know this from the proceedings that took place a few months ago. So in February, at the end of 2023, he breaks a rib, or he bruises a rib, or he has an injury to his ribs from coughing. He's ill, and his frailty, this is something that he contends with because he has osteoporosis. And so that just, again, brings into focus what Julian Assange is going through. So we're in 2024, and I'm going to start winding this down and just play a clip or two of where we are at in this case, because it's 2024, and we've seen that no matter what civil liberties and press freedom organizations and doctors who have observed Julian Assange and others have said, he is kept in Belmarsh. He has not been allowed to be set free. There have been no end in sight for this yet. We've seen some potential hope, I guess, if you can call it that, as there's more chatter about plea negotiations, as maybe Biden is signaling that something is shifting in the Justice Department by saying they're considering Australia's request. But we'll get to that in just a moment here. But again, I'm the author of the book Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. If you would like a copy, you can go to project-censored.org. There's much, much more in the book beyond Julian Assange's time in Belmarsh. And again, don't give money. If you want to support this work that you're hearing about, this independent journalism, you go to the dissenter.org, become a subscriber, or you can donate. Don't give through YouTube. Don't give through Google. Don't give money to support journalism through any of these tech platforms. You can do it directly here and support people like myself. I've featured work from Chip Gibbons and Mohammed Almazi on this case, and there will be more coverage and reporting going forward. We're in this kind of limbo, as we often are. Julian Assange is frequently plunged into limbo. We're waiting to find out what the U.S. government is going to say to the courts to assure them that Julian Assange won't be put to death if he is on trial, and also, like during sentencing, won't have the death penalty imposed against him. Oh, and that his constitutional rights, the First Amendment, that he'll have those rights as he goes through the trial. And I imagine that those are fairly simple things to say to the court if said the right way. The high court basically gave them a cheat sheet on how to save their case from being put into an appeal. Then that'll be difficult for Julian Assange because he runs out of any options in the UK legal system and has to go to the European Court of Human Rights to fight for his freedom, to try and prevent being extradited. All right, so I said that I would play the. I'm going to play this clip that was on Sky News, and this is Sky News Australia, and I want to play this. This is Jen Robinson, who's an attorney for Julian Assange, and then Gabriel Shipton is in this as well. That's the brother of Julian Assange, and here they are talking about Joe Biden. He was asked by a reporter. He said something like, "I'm considering what Australia has asked when it comes to ending the case." So here, I'll just take a quick moment here to pull this up. I just have to get the right window and play it. But thank you. We've got many of you out there who are tuned into this broadcast. I'm so thankful for your engagement and your interest in this. And so here I pulled this up, and this is why I'm wearing the headphones. So now I can play this, and you all can watch.
Joe Biden has given WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and his supporters and family the biggest sign of hope that he may yet be freed. Joining us live this morning is Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, and his brother, Gabriel Shipton. Good morning to you both. Jennifer, I'll start with you first. I suppose the remark could mean anything, but he definitely heard the question from the reporter because it was said twice. Are you boosted by Biden's response at all?
We are, of course, encouraged by his response, Pete. This is what we've been asking for over 5 years. It's the 5th anniversary today that Julian's been in a high security prison, since he was arrested in the UK and since he's been in prison in the UK in relation to this extradition request. Since 2010, we've been saying this is a dangerous precedent that's being set. Since the Trump administration initiated this indictment, not just us, but all free speech groups have been saying that this is setting a dangerous precedent. And this is what we've been calling for. So we certainly hope that it was a serious remark and that the US will act on it.
So, I mean, there has been the question of whether or not, if Julian Assange was extradited to the US, whether a death penalty would apply to it. I suppose that kind of cloud might still be hanging over Biden's response, might it not?
Well, of course, the High Court in the UK has asked the US to provide assurances both that Julian would, if he's extradited to the United States, that he would not face the death penalty and that he would be enabled to rely on the First Amendment, that he'd have constitutional free speech protections. The US has not yet responded to those assurances. And so it's interesting in this context, when the ball's been put back in the US court by the British courts, that the US president is coming out saying that they're considering dropping it. As I said, we've been asking for this to happen. The Biden administration should drop this case. This is the position we've been putting for a long time. It's what we've been asking the Australian government to ask of the US government. And so we really hope that this is the position that the US government is now going to take.
Yeah, it has gone long enough, that's for sure. Gabriel, over to you now. So from a family perspective, how do you feel about those comments from Biden this morning?
Well, I mean, it was a nice surprise to wake up to this morning, these comments from the president. But really, I see it as a sort of a foot in the door now for the Australian government and those people advocating for Julian around the world to really double down on these comments and really push hard now for Julian to be returned home to his family, back to Australia. Biden has opened the door a little bit here, and it's really the time for those advocating for Julian in the government and others abroad. Julian's high-profile advocates in governments all around the world to really jump on these comments and really push hard, because I think now is a really time to seize that moment to get Julian back to Australia. Yeah,
last time we spoke, Gabriel, he didn't attend that court hearing because he wasn't feeling well. How's he doing at the moment?
Well, he's he's hanging in there. This whole process has taken its toll on him. And, we're told by medical experts that he can recover if he's let out of prison. But the longer he's kept in there, the longer he is in danger of, just wasting away and losing his life. And that's what we're really fearful of his family, is that he can't hang on, that he won't make it through this process.
Okay. Gabriel and Jennifer, really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you. We'll talk.
All right, so that was the Sky News Australia segment. It had Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's brother, Jen Robinson, a longtime lawyer for Julian Assange. And as you can see there, there's a couple of things that need to be emphasized. I think there are some reasons for a little bit of hope. I do think from a legal perspective, if you're working on Julian Assange's case as a part of the legal team, listen to what Jennifer says there. Jen Robinson says that the US government hasn't really come forward with these assurances yet to the court. They do have until April 14th or 15th, I think, to do, but because they haven't just quickly submitted what they're going to say to the high court to avoid an appeal, it is an opening. It's an opening at this point to have plea negotiations and maybe say that you're not going to push for this case anymore. And maybe it's not even necessary to have a hearing about assurances with the High Court of Justice and go through that, because that's what will happen in May if they submit some kind of promises about how they would treat Julian Assange. So that's one thing. And then we hear from Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's brother, that this is a foot in the door, that this can be used as a moment to signal to all kinds of people throughout the world to go to parliamentarians, to go to different politicians that, excuse me, my cat is choosing to be very vocal, and I do not doubt that you can hear the cat. So I will acknowledge that I can hear the cat as well, who has entered my live broadcast space and is sharing her opinions about life in my surroundings at the moment. But again, as I'm concluding the broadcast, I don't expect to be going much longer. What needs to be said about the comment from Biden is that the U.S. has typically taken this approach of, yeah, I could go grab the cat, but now the cat is walking across counters and headed to a window, so I'm not going to go chase down the cat. Although it would be a nice break from all of this, and there was an embassy cat that Julian Assange had, and I hope that perhaps Julian Assange could be freed and reunited with his cat, along with his children and wife. So, for the longest time, it was no comment from the Biden White House. In fact, last week, that's what White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre had to say. And so to say that they are considering it is a different signal that is being given out. We've seen Antony Blinken asked about the case. He was in Australia when he was asked about the case, and he defended the seriousness of the allegations. The State Department's position has been to defend the seriousness of the allegations. Basically put their stamp of approval on the charges against Julian Assange, a journalist, even as they speak about things in terms of like journalism is not a crime, which we know that to not be true if you are endorsing the jailing of Julian Assange in Belmarsh. Now, does considering mean the same as concerns? Like we've heard that the Biden White House, the larger Biden administration, has concerns about Israel's assault on Gaza. There are incidents that happen, and they're concerned. Is considering just like a kind of cousin? And is there some kind of sinister nature to what we are hearing from Joe Biden when he says considering? Does that really open the door to Julian Assange, or does that plant false hope? Look, along the way, you can go all the way back to 2013 when there was a Washington Post article that said that Obama had this New York Times problem, so his Justice Department is not going to indict Julian Assange. And because of that, we see that Julian Assange is not going to be prosecuted. He's not going to be charged for publishing documents from Chelsea Manning. Now, maybe there'll be other offenses, but they're deciding that this is not one in which it's worth it to risk freedom of the press under the First Amendment. They're not going to go put journalists on trial, and they can't really stop with Julian Assange. They would have to go charge New York Times editors, New York Times writers, so on and so forth. So does this mean that they believe that, so at that point, that was false hope for Julian Assange, is what I'm trying to say. And at that point, Julian Assange didn't leave the Ecuador embassy. They recognized that to exit and just take the US government on good faith that they weren't going to pursue him, that was not a risk that was worth taking. And I think history shows that that was a smart move, although it has been very harsh on his health, the deterioration that he has suffered because he did not leave Ecuador London embassy and take a chance. But then there was the case hanging over him from Sweden, and there were all these different things that were happening that could have made it possible for the US to gain custody and then bring charges at some point for, whatever. And of course, after 2016, it changes because they're talking about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks like it's some outfit that is working on behalf of the Russian government. And of course, that's entered this case a little bit because we're worried that in sentencing, there could be some aggravating evidence that would be introduced where US prosecutors claim that Julian Assange was engaged in espionage in a classic sense, spying on behalf of a foreign power, and that maybe that will add to this injustice that we're seeing. And so I'll go ahead and wrap up here. And I thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and end with some words from Julian Assange. Stella clipped this, and this was in Oslo. This was at the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2010. I'm just going to play some of this. Again, as we talk about the case and I go through all of the details of Julian Assange's imprisonment, which you could go to thedissenter.org. If you go to thedissenter.org and you become a subscriber, not only you find the article right now, not only will you find the piece that I put together for this 5-year anniversary, this bleak, dismal 5-year anniversary, but you can find other articles on Julian Assange's case, as well as articles on whistleblowers and press freedom stories that I have covered that do relate to what we're seeing in this particular case. But Julian Assange is someone that we need to share what he was contributing. So if you believe that it is unjust what Julian Assange has endured, let's remember how good of an advocate he was against war. He was a peace advocate. Let's remember how good he was at speaking up for whistleblowers, how good he was at articulating these issues, speaking about technology. And let's recognize that that is what is being taken from us as well. Not only do we not have WikiLeaks because Julian Assange is in prison, not only do we see the dismantling of an outlet that could be a resource for whistleblowers to turn to, human rights activists and others to go to and expose governments, not just the United States, governments all around the world could benefit, or people around the world could benefit from exposing their governments through publications provided to WikiLeaks. That's not really possible with this prosecution. But we also know that Julian Assange was somebody who was a writer of opinion articles published by the Washington Post, invited on Democracy Now! This is how he is also a journalist. Speaking about these issues also makes him someone who is being attacked. And he is being charged and he is being attacked because he has this advocacy. And you can point to it. You can see, as they say in the case, political opinions that exist that people in the Trump administration, people in Biden's administration currently, and people in Obama's administration, they did not like that Julian Assange held these views, and it put him in their crosshairs. Particularly Mike Pompeo and the CIA turned on Julian Assange when the Vault 7 materials were published about CIA cyber hacking capabilities. But that's not the only part of the US government that has a vengeful spirit when it comes to Julian Assange. So let's play out. I'm not going to say anything after this. I think what Julian Assange says will be good enough. So I thank you for tuning into this broadcast. And I'm going to play the clip that I have pulled here. This is Julian Assange at the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2010. I'm just going to go back a little bit and we'll listen to some of it. And then I'll just say goodbye to you. And again, though, I thank you for tuning into this broadcast and supporting this work. I can't do this. We can't do this as journalists. We can't cover these issues. We can't document all of this and speak about what's significant and important without people like you who take time to pay attention and engage. And so I thank you for this engagement. I see your comments. I see all the people there who have gratitude, and I'm glad that you were able to tune in. So I'm going to leave you with some of Julian Assange's words, and you all have a good rest of your week.
Israel. And I don't want to talk, however, today too much about that, because censorship in the West is also a problem. And censorship in the West is used to legitimize censorship in other countries. And abuses in the West of Enlightenment ideals, which we should all hold dear, and the corrosion of those ideals not only impoverishes Western countries, it is also used as an excuse for terrible abuses in other countries, in particular countries that follow the common law that was set up by the British Empire. For example, abuses of libel law are used in Africa to imprison some fine journalists in severe conditions based upon precedents set in the UK. So I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with the basics of my work, and I'll just try and go very briefly through that so you can understand where I'm coming from. As a journalist and as a programmer and as someone who was involved in the embryonic internet and bringing the internet to people and bringing that great tool of information and publishing freedom to people, I saw that we could achieve a lot of reform with a little bit of work. And of course, you all know this, and you should remember Solzhenitsyn's words that in the right moment, one word of truth outweighs the world. And Solzhenitsyn was referring to a world of lies. But this still is true for information across the world. And it's also true for information in the West, that in some cases, one classified video can possibly stop a war. And maybe 50 definitely can. So we tried to pull together a system to automate that process, to get as much new material, censored material, restricted material, material that we thought would achieve political reform into the historic record and keep it there. And we have, in the process, become the publisher of last resort. We, in the past 3 years, have been attacked over 100 times legally and have succeeded against all those defenses by building an international multi-jurisdictional network, by using every trick in the book that multinational companies use to route money through tax havens. Instead, we route information through different countries to take advantage of their laws, both for publishing and for the protection of sources. And that endeavor has been successful in putting over 1 million restricted documents into the historical record that weren't there before. That's more pages of information than is in Wikipedia. We have gotten into the intellectual record that had been restricted. So you may